I usually do Star Wars Legends or Extended Universe books in the Star Wars series, not for a lack of wanting to cover canon material, but a lot of the time Legends books just had more freedom than the modern Star Wars books that are in modern Disney canon, though I thought Shadow of the Sith, following an adventure with Luke and Lando between the events of Return of the Jedi and Force Awakens, sounded interesting. Also notably taking place in 21 ABY, 13 years before the events of the sequel trilogy, but put out following the release of all those films, thus potentially allowing for them to fill in some of the gaps. However, for better or for worse, this novel is almost 100% an apology letter and explanation of the events of one of the messier films in the sequel trilogy, The Rise of Skywalker, which I'm somewhat mixed on, but we'll cover that film eventually. I suppose, though, having more context for that mess of a film might help my enjoyment. The book started production after the cancellation of a planned novel, The Mandalorian, an original novel which was likely cancelled since The Mandalorian was a smash sensation and the continuity team didn't want to step on any toes, which is more or less the announcement they made when it was cancelled. However, the planned author of the book, Adam Christopher, seemed to have been doing good work on the novel as Lucasfilm and Del Rey Publishing allowed the author to pivot over to a different novel, Shadow of the Sith. The story follows Dathan and his wife Miramir as they fly through space, attempting to keep themselves and their daughter Rey safe from the Sith that are hunting them, since, as you may know if you watch The Rise of Skywalker, Dathan is the partial genetic clone of Palpatine who turned his back on his father and the Sith to start a family. Meanwhile, Luke, who now runs the Jedi Temple with his Padawan and nephew Ben Solo, starts having dark visions and happens upon a dark Sith artifact, while elsewhere in the galaxy, Lando learns of what is happening to Rey and her family, who are being chased down, enlisting the help of Luke Skywalker to try to find the girl in hopes it may lead to some new leads onto where his daughter is following her abduction. Ochi, the assassin in charge of taking care of Rey and her family, meanwhile, enlists the help of a Sith cultist that can channel the mind of Darth Noctis to find this unknown family he has to take care of. Luke thinks the capture of Ochi may lead to a lead in the Sith Wayfinder and location of Exegol, which Luke wants to explore to find out the secrets of the Sith, which will hopefully explain his dark visions that he's been having recently. Eventually, while following the trail, Luke needs to confront this cultist who is possessing Kaiza, a cult member, but she gets away. Luke enlists help from an old friend he saved from the dark side, Komat. Komat tells them of Kiza and explains that these Sith cultists look for artifacts, with Dark Noctis using her ancient power to possess Kiza. Ochi, meanwhile, is still chasing Dathan and his family, who are seemingly running out of options, though Lando, Komat, and Luke are in pursuit, hoping to beat Ochi to the family. Eventually, Luke gets his rematch with Darth Noctis in the body of Kiza. He tries getting Kiza to resist, but eventually she dies after Luke defeats Noctis and destroys her mask, ruining the possessive power of the artifact. Ochi catches the family after Luke and Lando lose the trace, and he manages to kill the parents, but unbeknownst to them, they already dropped Rey off on Jakku, setting her up on the planet she starts her journey on years later in The Force Awakens. Ochi heads to the planet Paison's Hidden Valley after Rey's mom sends him a fake clue, which, after hastily leaving the craft, sees him fall into a sinkhole, never to re-emerge. Eventually his body is found in The Rise of Skywalker, though. Lando finds the father and mother's body, but not Rey, fearing the worst, but after some time away, he vows to keep looking and heads to the planet Pasan, hoping to eventually find out what happened to the girl and Ochi. Luke, meanwhile, heads back to the temple after his long journey to reunite with his Padawan, a little defeated by the unsuccessful quest, though happy he stopped the reign of Darth Noctis from coming back into power. Luke is on this mission because he's been seeing dark visions, partially led on by the Sith cultists searching for the artifacts surrounding the lost culture, and partially to help Lando in his quest to find more information on his missing daughter. As it turns out, their mission has lots of crossover, and Luke and Lando are two characters that don't have nearly enough time together in Star Wars media, with Lando being more of a Han Solo offshoot and Luke largely doing his own thing during Empire Strikes Back, with Lando off on a different mission during Return of the Jedi as well. I think if I have any gripe with the pairing is that I think they should have just went all out and included the whole Falcon crew. Like, screw it at this point. It is coincidental, though, that Lando runs into this plot as Luke is looking into these dark visions that he's been having, and that they're going after Rey and her family. Why not just give us some moments with Han and Leia too at that point? It already takes a pretty high level of suspension of disbelief to buy into the plot. I also kind of expected these dark visions to tie into Kylo Ren and his origins more at the Jedi Temple, and I hope they explore that plot further in the future, but Kylo Ren is pretty irrelevant to this novel other than appearing as Ben Solo briefly towards the start and end of the novel. It does sound like the Marvel Star Wars comics are moving to show the events between the original trilogy and sequel trilogies, so perhaps some of these stories will come up soon, but I think it was a missed opportunity because frankly at this point, why not just show us more about Kylo Ren? The sequel trilogy is over. I kind of want to learn more of the characters that were there. Lando, I think, has much more going on than Luke. It is revealed that he lost a daughter to pirates who likely sold her into slavery, so when he runs into these people attempting to take Rey and her parents, he creates a personal vendetta to save them. This Lando is definitely a bit schlubby and past his glory days, as we witness in the films, though he is also, as a result of his daughter's kidnapping, a bit more of a soft heart, trying to save others and helping more without seeing his own benefit as an underline to his motives like he does in the original trilogy. This was somewhat of what we saw in Return of the Jedi a bit, but this Lando is far more selfless than the man we saw in the original trilogy. This is kind of a push past nice Lando from Return of the Jedi, seeing him be more affected by personal tragedy, and I like this direction for Lando. Based on the character that was established in the film and this book, it makes a lot of sense. Following the discovery of the bodies of Rey's parents, Lando is devastated and goes into exile on Pasan in hopes to find Ochi and Rey and uncover the mystery of who Rey is, since she wasn't present at the murder scene of Rey's parents. Dathan is Rey's father and is married to Miramir. We see his personality fleshed out more from a 2-second flashback in The Rise of Skywalker, and he is essentially a hopeless survivor that hates what his pseudo-father Palpatine stood for and just wants a normal life for Miramir and Rey. Unfortunately, that's not possible when the former Emperor is your father. He is at times too guarded and cautious, hesitant to have much hope, and kinda just sits around complaining a bunch, but he's alright. I'd be complaining too. Miramir, in contrast, also wants the best for her husband and Rey, but in contrast to her husband, is courageous and full of hope. In a lot of ways, Rey would go on to inherit some of her sense of hope and courage from her mother, as she inherited the Force from her father and grandfather. In one last act of defiance against Ochi, she and her husband hide Rey on Jakku, and she tricks Ochi through a false clue at the time of her death to head to Pasan, which leads the overeager bounty hunter to his death. Komat is Luke's friend, a former Sith cultist that hides in exile on Polar with her 2 droid companions. Komat basically is here to dump exposition about Darth Noctis and Kiza on Luke and Lando, but she's a solid character and walks the audience through Kiza's mind state better, which adds a bit more to this admittedly slightly undercooked villain. Darth Noctis, much like someone like Darth Plagueis, was obsessed with the idea of immortality, but only succeeds in part, with Noctis, through her artifacts, able to control the minds of the people who put them on. It is a bit different than Darth Bane's essence transfer from Legends or straight immortality, though much like all previous Sith who tried in canon and Legends, Noctis never really fully succeeded in her goal to become immortal. Hundreds of years later after Noctis' death, Noctis reemerges, taking the body of troubled Sith cultist Kiza, before her mask was destroyed by Luke, thus causing her dark magic to no longer work and killing her once and for all. Kiza, the host body of Noctis, is a conflicted spirit, much like other Sith cultists, and is disenfranchised and looking for power and artifacts until she realizes she can't control or fully grasp the dark power of the Sith, despite her best efforts. Noctis drives her mad and eventually leads to her confronting Luke Skywalker using Noctis's mask and artifacts to draw upon Noctis's power. Ultimately, she is killed, and Luke is unable to save the fallen spirit, despite his best efforts. Ochi of Bastoon is the final character and is an assassin associated loosely with the Sith, with his glory days being during the Clone Wars when he killed a number of Jedi, but later being successful during the Galactic Civil War as well, causing a reincarnated Palpatine to send him after his son Dathan with the help of some Sith cultists, though he never fully realizes his mission and ends up dying. Ochi has a Sith dagger gifted to him that doubles as a second Wayfinder. This weapon feeds on the blood of its victims and is perfect for the ruthless killer, as it drives him to kill for the taste of power, kind of like a drug. It's sort of an interesting concept, this Sith dagger. Tonally, the novel is dark and kind of hopeless, and that leads to the novel being sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally frustrating. Luke and Lando can't succeed at their mission, or Rey wouldn't be in place for her appearances in the sequel trilogy, so the family run and escape, near miss after near miss, only to run in again with Luke and Lando and get close, with Ochi on their tail. Eventually, after about 500 pages, or 17 hours if you listen to the audiobooks, the characters are still just out of reach. Some questions like the fate of Lando's daughter are still a mystery, opening even more mystery box elements that J.J. Abrams are so obsessed with. What happened to this mysterious daughter? We still don't know. I hope one day we get some answers on this plot thread, but it's seemingly something that will need to go unanswered until Rey's story in the sequel trilogy concludes or happens. But even then, that film will have 15 years of a time jump, so who knows if Lando's even going to be in it. Mirror is hopeful, so is Lando and Luke, but by the end of this book, it almost feels like The Empire Strikes Back if it was never allowed to have a follow-up, and has no plans to look further into things like Lando's daughter in her metaphoric carbonite. Not much is happening in terms of Kylo's turn to the dark side, nothing about Snoke, and more. It really is Palpatine focused, which is kind of odd given that that's a retcon. I wish Snoke had something going on, perhaps, since he is another kind of question mark in the Star Wars universe they never did anything with. It inherits much of its shitty mystery boxes from those films, and it might answer some questions, but it opens other mystery boxes for us to explore and scratch our heads over, almost acting like Snoke never existed when they talk so much about Palpatine and stuff, and that it was just Palpatine the whole time. Like, how can I even peg a tone on something like this where so much stuff happens and it's frustrating. Then on the other hand, Adam Christopher had some good prose and interesting villains, making some aspects pretty enjoyable, adding new lore to the Sith lineage and canon, establishing some characters more that were undercooked like many of the best EU novels did. It's descriptive and intriguing, and despite being sometimes repetitive, it had lots of positive aspects as well, making this such a mixed bag for me. Look, this novel isn't terrible, but it really sets out more to close plot lines that were opened by J.J. Abrams with his various mystery box plot lines. He did a half-assed job of concluding, or just never really touched again. Who are Rey's parents in more detail, which honestly isn't something I really cared to know after the twist. It's just some people, one of which is kind of a Palpatine clone, but doesn't really act like Palpatine. Also, Dathan doesn't really talk about Palpatine much, so it's pretty inconsequential that he's a clone. It explains who Ochi was, the assassin, and we get a further explanation on why the Sith dagger is so important in The Rise of Skywalker. We see more about Luke, though it doesn't show much on him losing his faith in the Jedi, as we saw in The Last Jedi, which I think would have been pretty important to cover, but they didn't really cover that. I don't know. While Darth Noctis and her whole plot feels very EU, it's not really in a good way, and while I like Luke and Lando's rapport, it's just not enough to save this book from exploring some lore that either didn't need to be in the film or should have been explained in the film. It feels like an apology for incompetent leadership and an attempt to retroactively tape up the plot holes of the sequel trilogy in an albeit decent novel mostly. So I'm kind of in a weird place with it. I like what Adam Christopher wrote here, but it just seemed so trapped in the confines of trying to fix lore that really should have never been made. And that's kind of a problem these novels face over the EU, which is not stepping on the toes of the more important film and TV projects, which are pretty active compared to the George Lucas era, where in the novels they usually did major pushes, like the New Jedi Order novels, for example. I think Disney and Del Rey need to allow more freedoms in terms of context and stories that authors are allowed to tell, since I feel Christopher was really stuck in a box on this one, and it was a detriment to the storytelling of Star Wars and his vision for this novel. This era of Star Wars, as I stated, seems to be coming back a bit in the comics, despite the lack of representation in the novels, with many novels looking more into the pre-Phantom Menace and High Republic eras, and the films and television series doing more of the early New Republic pre-Rey's involvement era. It is sort of interesting seeing something that ties most directly into the sequels, but while I think it fills some plot holes, it simultaneously pops up some new dead ends. As I said, hopefully after the new Rey film or films, we get more into this time period between episode 9 and these new films, and I'm sure someone will add closure to Lando's kid and other plots that remain unsolved in the films down the line. But until then, I guess this is just a mixed bag of a novel from the Disney era that gets the characters well, that isn't allowed the freedom to really do more with them than what it ended up doing.